Hi everyone. So we have one more shape that we're going to learn to find the surface area of, and that shape is a cylinder. So I want you to think about a cylinder like a can of soup. Okay, that's a cylinder. It's made up of two circles, so the top and the bottom of the can are circles, and then the shape that goes around the outside of the can, if you think about it, if you were to peel off the label on the can, what shape would it become if you flatten it out? It would be a rectangle. So it's kind of hard to visualize, but this picture that I have here kind of shows you have your two circles, the top and bottom of the can, and then when you unroll that label around the can, it turns into a rectangle. Okay, so a cylinder is made up of two circles and a rectangle. This picture that I have here, this is called a net. A net is when you take a three-dimensional shape and you lay it flat. Okay, so it's kind of like unfolded. And so it's easy to see what makes up that three-dimensional shape when you're looking at the net. So there's a special formula that we're going to use for surface area of a cylinder versus in the other shapes. What we've done is we've just found the area of every side. It's much easier just to use a formula for this one, just because the rectangle is not as easy as length times width. Okay, I'm going to explain that in a second. So first of all, if you remember, the area of a circle is equal to pi r squared. So the first part of our formula is going to show that there's two circles that I'm finding the area of. So if there's two circles, I need 2 pi r squared. So 2 pi r squared is the first part of my surface area formula. And then I need to add to that the area of the rectangle. Now remember, the area of the rectangle is not as easy as length times width because we're talking about this, I'll just keep calling it the wrapper on the can. Okay, so the length of that rectangle is actually the same as the perimeter or the circumference of the circle. Okay, so picture that for a minute. If you take that wrapper and you wrap it around the can, its length is the same as the distance around the circle. And the distance around a circle is its circumference, which we've learned is 2 pi r. So that's why this side right here is labeled 2 pi r. That's the length of your rectangle. And then the width of your rectangle is actually the height of your cylinder, or the height of your can. So instead of length times width, we do 2 pi r times the height. And so that's the second part of your surface area formula. Okay, so a little bit more complicated if you were to just find the area of those three shapes and add them together, which is again why we use our formula. Okay, now one thing that's important is to remember when to use 3.14 versus when to use pi versus when to leave your answer in terms of pi. So if you think back to the lesson we did when we did area and circumference of circles, those are the three situations you'll see. So I have a little note here. It says, use the pi key on your calculator unless the directions say to use 3.14. Okay, so if it says anything about rounding, we're using the pi key. If it says to use 3.14, we're using 3.14. I don't think I'm going to give you any that say in terms of pi, but if you saw that, that would just mean to leave the pi alone. Okay, so let's do some examples so you can see how this works. So number 1 says, find the surface area of each cylinder to the nearest hundredth. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to write down our formula. 2 pi r squared plus 2 pi r h. Okay, so a couple of things. It says to the nearest hundredth. So what that means is we are using our pi key. So when I start to do my substitution step, 2 times pi is going to stay 2 times pi. R squared, remember r is the radius, and the radius of this circle on the top and bottom of the can is 10. So I'm going to do times 10 squared plus 2 times pi times the radius again, which we said was 10, times the height. And the height of the can is 15. So this was my radius and this was my height. So really, those are the only two numbers that you're plugging into your formula. Okay, so when you go ahead and type this in your calculator, make sure you hit the pi key. So 2 times pi key times 10 squared, or 10 times 10, plus 2 times pi key times 10 times 15. Okay, and remember, we're rounding to the nearest hundredth, which is 2 decimal places out. So your answer should be 1,570.80, and this would be meters squared, because remember, when we have surface area, we use the same label as area. Okay, so let's look at number 2. We have another cylinder here, so I'm going to start with my formula. Oh my gosh, you guys probably can hear that music in the background. That's my daughter playing with her jewelry box. Sorry about that. Okay, so there's my formula. Again, let's pick out the important information. So the radius of the circle, the bases of your cylinder, is 30, and the height is 40. Okay, and again, we're still going to the nearest hundredth here, so we're going to use our pi key. So let's leave pi alone, and let's put 2 times pi times 30 squared, because that's my radius, plus 2 times pi times 30 times the height, which is 40. Okay, so now if I go ahead and put that in my calculator, I'm going to have 13,194.69 centimeters squared. Okay, now number 3, we still have a cylinder here, it's just on its side. So let's start with the formula, 2 pi r squared plus 2 pi r h. And what's important here, the radius is 3, and because this is on its side, we're just going to say that the height is 10. All right, so again, we're using the pi key because we're rounding, so 2 times pi times the radius, 3 squared, plus 2 times pi times the radius, 3, times the height, 10. All right, so we're going to type that into our calculator. Be very careful, make sure you are putting the addition in between. That's a common mistake kids will make. Try and multiply the whole line, they forget the plus in the middle. Okay, so if I get my answer and I round it to the nearest hundredth, I'm getting 245.04 square inches. All right, awesome. Let's do one more together here. So another cylinder, 2 pi r squared plus 2 pi r h. Okay, so this 3 yards that they show us, that's actually the diameter. Remember, the diameter goes all the way across through the center of the circle, and we need the radius. So if I cut that in half, I'll get the radius is 1.5, and then my height is 2. All right, so let's do our substitution step. 2 times pi times 1.5 squared plus 2 times pi times 1.5 times 2. All right, take a minute, type all that in your calculator. And to the nearest hundredth, you should be getting 32.99 yards squared. All right, so what I'd like you to do now is pause the video. I'm going to have you try the next 2 cylinders on your own, and let's see if you can come up with the right answer. And then you can play it and see if you got it. All right, so for this one, 2 pi r squared plus 2 pi r h. Okay, so my radius here was 5 and my height was 3. So 2 times pi times 5 squared plus 2 times pi times 5 times 3. So if you got this one right, it was 251.33 inches squared. Okay, if you didn't get that, it could be that you forgot to find the radius. You might have put 10 in instead of 5. So just be careful of that. All right, number 6, let's see if you got this one right. 2 pi r squared plus 2 pi r h. So here, if my diameter is 6.2, that means that my radius is 3.1, and 12.2 is my height. So 2 times pi times 3.1 squared plus 2 times pi times 3.1 times 12.2. Okay. If you typed all that in correctly, you should have gotten 298.01 millimeters squared. Okay, so those are some straightforward questions on how to find the surface area of a cylinder. So let's look at some that are written out. So number 7 says, find the surface area of a cylinder with a height of 12 inches and a radius of 4 inches. Use pi equals 3.14. Okay, so this one's a little different, not only because we don't have a picture, they're just telling us the height and the radius, but also because they're now saying to use 3.14 for pi. So no longer should we be using the pi key. Okay, so if you want, you can always draw yourself a picture to help. Some of you might feel like you don't need it since they're giving you the information, but this is what your cylinder would look like if you were to draw it out. Okay, so let's start with our formula. 2 pi r squared plus 2 pi r h. Okay, so when we're doing our substitution step, again, remember, now we're not using our pi key. So instead of writing pi, I need to substitute in 3.14. The radius of our cylinder is 4, so 4 squared, plus 2 times 3.14 for pi, times the radius again, which is 4, times the height, which they tell us is 12. Okay, so there should be no rounding when you get your answer to this. Whatever the decimal is, we're going to write it out. Because we're using 3.14, it's already been rounded for us. Okay, so if you type all that in, 401.92 inches squared is what you should get. Okay, number 8. A tuna can has a height of 1 inch and a diameter of 3 inches. Find the surface area of the can. Leave your answer in terms of pi. Okay, so I wasn't sure if I gave you one in terms of pi, but I did. So let's try this out. First thing I'm going to do is draw my tuna can. Tuna cans are usually pretty short, right? It has a height of 1 inch and it has a diameter, so diameter goes all the way across, of 3 inches. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to figure out the radius because I need the radius for my formula. So the radius is half of the diameter, which would be 1.5. All right, so let's write our surface area formula here. Okay, so because we're leaving our answer in terms of pi, I have to make sure that I'm putting in a pi in my formula, just like you were doing if you were going to use the pi key. So I'm going to write 2 times pi times r squared, which is 1.5 squared, plus 2 times pi times 1.5, that's the radius, times the height, which is 1. Okay, so this is the tricky part. Because it's in terms of pi, I can't really go through and put this in my calculator. What I need to do is I need to kind of treat this like it's order of operations. So on the left side here, I'm going to basically ignore that pi is there, and I'm going to do 2 times 1.5 squared. Okay, so 1.5 squared is actually 2.25, and 2.25 times 2 is 4.5. So over here, I'm going to get 4.5, but then I need to put a pi on the end because it's in terms of pi. Plus, now I'm going to do the same thing to this side. So I'm going to leave the pi alone, but I'm going to do 2 times 1.5 times 1, and that gives me 3. So over here, I would have 3 pi. And then my last step is to add those together. Think about this as it being like a 4.5x plus a 3x. You can actually add those together because they're like terms. And so 4.5 plus 3 gives me 7.5, and I just bring along the pi, and then I label it inches squared. Okay, so in terms of pi for this one is a little bit trickier, but it's really just an extra step. Okay, number 9. A hot chocolate container has a height of 10 inches and a radius of 2.5 inches. What is the surface area of the container to the nearest hundredth? All right, so we have our hot chocolate container. Looks something like that. The height is 10 inches and the radius is 2.5 inches. And they want the surface area of the container. 2 pi r squared plus 2 pi r h. Now notice it says to the nearest hundredth. So what that means is that we need to use the pi key. Okay, so when I'm plugging in for my substitution step, I'm going to leave pi as pi. The radius is 2.5, so 2.5 squared plus 2 times pi times 2.5 times 10. All right, so we can go ahead and type this entire thing in our calculator using the pi key. Don't forget the plus in the middle there. And we should be getting 196.35 inches squared. All right, last one. Ben wanted to wrap 2 presents for his friend's birthday. He had 80 square feet of wrapping paper. Determine whether Ben is able to wrap both presents using the amount of wrapping paper that he has. Okay, so remember, surface area is about covering an object. And so we're trying to cover or wrap these 2 cylinders, these 2 gifts. And we know that we have a total, or Ben has a total, of 80 square feet of wrapping paper. So what we need to do is we need to figure out the surface area of both of those cylinders, and then we need to add them together and see if 80 is going to be enough. So let's go ahead and let's find the surface area of this one. I'll just call this A. Okay, so I'm going to show my work right here. So we're going to start with our formula, 2 pi r squared plus 2 pi r h. Okay, now it doesn't give us any specifics about whether we're using the pi key or whether we should be using 3.14. So let's go ahead and use the pi key just so that we are getting a more accurate representation of what the actual surface area is. Because if I use 3.14, I'm going to get a rounded answer. And so we'll still have to round the answer, but at least it'll be a little bit more accurate. So I'm going to keep pi. The radius of that first cylinder is 1, so times 1 squared plus 2 times pi times 1 again for the radius and times 2 for the height. All right, so let's go ahead and type this in our calculator again using your pi key. And why don't we round it to the nearest hundredth? So when I go ahead and I type all that in, I'm going to get 18.85 feet squared. Okay, if I round it to the nearest hundredth. Okay, so that's the first one. Now let's figure out the surface area of the second one. Now, one thing I want to point out is that the second one has dimensions that are in inches, and we're trying to figure out how many square feet. So what I would recommend doing is changing those dimensions into feet before you even start. So the height of that cylinder is 36 inches, which I know is 3 feet because there's 12 inches in every foot, and 36 divided by 12 is 3. For the diameter, if it's 48 inches, if I want to convert that to feet, 48 divided by 12 is 4. So that means the diameter is 4 feet. But I need to make sure I know the radius because that's what I need for the formula. So the radius is actually 2 feet. Okay, so let's go ahead and find the surface area of cylinder B. So 2 pi r squared. This might be the record for the noisiest video I've done. Holy cow. There's a lot going on in my house this morning. Okay, so 2 times pi times, okay, we found the radius to be 2, so 2 squared, plus 2 times pi times 2 again for the radius, and then 3 for the height. Okay, so type all that in using your pi key. And again, let's round it to the nearest hundredth. Okay, so I'm getting 62.83 feet squared. Okay, so now that we know the surface area of both of those cylinders, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add them together because that will tell me the total amount of wrapping paper or the total number of square feet I need to cover both gifts or to wrap both gifts. So if I add them together, 18.85 plus 62.83, I'm getting 81.68 feet squared. All right, so what does that mean? If he has 80 square feet and I need 81.68 square feet, he does not have enough. So my answer here is